Good day, young scholars. Today is an age of discovery, historical, global, and individual. I know you're looking at that horizon wondering where it is. In truth, Pacific Ocean, Morro Bay looking west, but it might well be the West African coast, looking west in the 1500s. Our question today is, what lay behind us in this age of discovery? West African empires and tribes from the 13th to the 16th century is the topic of our lecture today. Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires, and we'll look at the main features and the distinctive cultural forms of these empires. And then a short on tribalism, for which we have to rely a lot on modern studies of tribes, and with the assumption that humans resist change and maintain traditions. First, there's a little map of Africa, the northern part of Africa around the Saharan desert. You can see sort of the outlines of the north part of Africa and see some of the distinctive cities, Algiers, Tripoli, Marrakesh, and then down the West African coast here all the way along and under and into the Bight of Benin. Here is the the delta of the Niger River, and the Niger River flows from the north down into that delta, and you can see it makes a U up here in the west part of Africa, the sub-Saharan Africa. That's the central region for our study today of the three empires. We will see and hear about the city of Timbuktu, which becomes both a political and a literary center for these African empires. Gao will be one of the capitals, and Jenne here has today a mosque that was built in the period in which we're talking, but was rebuilt in the modern age. So the modern one is not the actual structure that had been there before. Also, this map's very nice because it shows you where the mountain range was, where much of the gold came from, that the empires could trade for. So West African Muslim culture as it's seen under the empires in Africa. The sources for these empires are Arab geographers and then the Europeans when they show up as well. And a little bit of archaeology. The archaeology in West Africa both suffers from a ability, the monies to put into archaeological digs, but also it's a region where things decay and disappear very quickly, so there's not a lot preserved, although there is some significant archaeological finds. So these empires, the Ghana is the first empire. It is its existence is debated, but somewhere around 300 AD, we think, before Muhammad was born and founded the Islamic faith. So you want to note that the early emperors, and all the way through actually, were tribal leaders, tribal kings that had formed and built empires, all the way to 1200 AD. So from 300 to 1200 AD, and an imperial power, political power, prior to Muslim faith's foundation, and then also after, so it lived between the two. The establishment of the main trade with West Africa as it went across the Sahara Desert began with the Ghana, as far as we know. They traded gold that they mined in their own mountains for salt that came from the North African region. So traders came from the North African region and brought salt down, and the sub-Saharan Western African tribesmen and merchants were willing to trade their gold for salt. The story is ounce for ounce. So an ounce of salt for an ounce of gold, which to us sounds ludicrous, and I don't know if it was quite exactly that rate, but I think the point is that the salt was very, very valuable in sub-Saharan Africa, and they were willing to pay a very high price in gold for that salt. Rulers were not Muslim. They were tribal men, tribal kings, but they did use Muslim clerks. So after the Muslim faith was founded and it reached the sub-Saharan West African region, these towns and cities and mosques were the places that educated and acculturated or produced an educated class that could be the clerks and the administrators for the Ghana kings and emperors. So not Muslim rulers, but nonetheless the Islamic faith started to provide them with a class of people that would help them to maintain their empires. I think that's the broad point on that. What replaces the Ghana Empire is the Mali Empire, and the Mali Empire lasts beyond 15, but from about 1235 until 1500 or the 1500s AD. It's in this period that Timbuktu really becomes the iconic trading city of the sub-Saharan West African region, and it also becomes a literary city. So it's a merchant city and a city where lots of mosques were built and an educated class was cultivated and libraries were put in. Of course, maybe not of course, but these rulers were in fact Muslim. So now the emperor was Muslim himself, and partly interested in spreading the Muslim religion. Mansa Musa is the most well-known of the Mali emperors because he takes a Hajj in 1324 across a Hajj to Mecca, across obviously sub-Saharan Africa and up into Cairo, and then across Cairo into the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, Medina and Mecca. The reason that his Hajj is so well known is that there were many accounts of when he showed up in Cairo. I think the distinctive feature of Mansa Musa in Cairo is that he brought so many people and so much gold with him that it led to an inflationary period in Cairo for years after he left. And that's how impressive he was to the Arab population that in Egypt at that time, right? And it also shows you the significance of this map here that was drawn by a Spanish, cartographer in Spain in 1375. And the cartographer here you can see he's made some very distinctive things that are distinctive features. The crown and the scepter and the object in the hand of the central king are all really bright gold, so he's emphasizing the gold. And the second thing that he emphasizes is that it's a Muslim region. So you have all of these mosques drawn in here all over the map, and this is only a detail of the map. The map, of course, is of Africa broadly. That's the most well-known map from 1375, a Spanish map. West African culture, West African empires, the last of which was the Songhai Empire. This map here shows you that, once again, the Niger River is in blue here coming all the way up and then down, and you can see Jenne, Timbuktu, and Gao on the Niger River. And this empire was the largest of them all because the Songhai emperors had a large army. We don't really know exactly how large it is, but some of the Arab geographers and explorers said that they could build an army of 200,000, and that army had cavalry in it as well. So that would be a significant army. though we are unsure of how big the army was, it obviously was one of the biggest armies that had ever been in the area, and they were able to exert their influence broadly across the West African region. Right? So this is by far and away larger than both the Mali and the Ghana empires. The Songhai Empire lasts from about 1400 to 1600. The founder of it is Sunni Ali, and he's most well known for and unique in trying to bridge the political relationship between the pagan cultures of the tribes and Muslim culture. So he tried to make it so these two people could live peacefully in the same region. So he had a distinctive rule because of that. And then also, as we said with the other ones, very important that it was a merchant city, and they encouraged commercial relations. And so the empire thrived during the Songhai period. Of course, those commercial relations would also lead to very strong commerce in slaves with the Europeans. But we haven't gotten there yet. We're going to look at West Africa first with its tribal cultures. The biggest tribe in the West, and now it's mostly in Nigeria, is the Obo. And I mentioned the Obo tribe because there's many different ones. But the Obo, because many Obo were captured and put onto slave ships and shipped to the Caribbean in the transatlantic slave trade from about 1500 through 1800. So that works as well as any, although this is certainly not the only tribe in the West African region, but one of the tribes where many of them were captured and made slaves. They lived in small villages. They made political marriages, so the members of the village would agree to marriages for the purpose of peace between tribes or different settlements of a tribe, right, and link connections, right, almost like, although we don't have political marriages, I agree, but nonetheless, families and businesses that sometimes benefit from marriages. But anyways, they made political marriages, and a tribesman could marry more than one person. So he could marry more than one person, as many as he could possibly take care of, or as he saw that he could take care of. So they would have 2, 3, 4 wives. When Muslims show up, they only allow for 4 wives, and only if you have the ability to take care of each wife equally, at least according to the Quran, right? But we call that polygamy, right? That they were able to marry more than one woman, and they did. As far as religion goes, it was varied and diverse, and so you can see from a Muslim point of view, this would be problematic. But they were animists. That means they believed there were spirits actually in nature, in a rock, in a tree, in the sky, right? Just like the North American continent. So they did have animist beliefs. They worshipped their ancestors, and they worshipped at oracles too. So you could go to an oracle and ask it a question about the future usually, right? And you would get an answer, and these oracles would have priestess or priest there that could interpret the answer of the oracle. So they believed these oracles could help them understand the future. They also were superstitious, so there were haunted places and things with these in their religion. A haunted forest. It was a bad omen to have twins, right? So there were lots of things that they were superstitious about. And then finally, I want to just say a few things about agriculture, because many of them came over, obviously, and participated in agricultural activities. In Africa, it was very common. They cultivated small fields. The nature of the land there is tropical, very porous, and so it lost its nutrients fast. So they would burn down the grasses or clear an area of field and cultivate that small field for a few years and then move on to the next to the extent they could move on to other fields. So they had either a struggle with fertility in their fields or they had to keep moving the field every couple of years, so not really unlike the New England region here. Women were the prime agricultural producers, so mostly women, and then also you want to know that they did cultivate rice in Africa, and they would bring that knowledge of that technology to the Americas with them. And finally, like I said, sources for tribal culture are very thin, so we rely on modern studies of tribes, and we rely on that, but also for us, there are more pleasurable ways besides scholarly articles to sort of get a sense of culture. And I always recommend, and many people do, a book by an author called Echebe, and the title of the book is Things Fall Apart. It's a literary account, so it's a story and a mystery of a death that occurs, but he tells all sorts about Africa. All sorts of things about tribalism in Africa. And the central theme in there is that this tribal culture is invaded by that modern industrial culture, and then there's a big conflict that takes place. It's a great book. The story's really good, and it does talk a lot about the things I've just talked to you about. The last topic in this, I know I said tribalism and the empires, but finally just slavery, since we're going into the transatlantic system, and just to look at slavery broadly, but this West African region would be caught up in a slave system that's somewhat unique, but slavery's got a long history and it's continuing even today. So, but the background, where do we even get the word from? It comes from Slav, because there was the Slavic peoples live in Central and Eastern Europe, right, where Russia, Czechoslovakia, the Baltic states, etc., are today. And so we get the word from that Slavic, the Slavic people, because the Southern Europeans in Constantinople and in the Muslim region would go up into the Balkan Peninsula and then up into the Slavic region as well. Serbia, and Serbians are Slavic. And they would capture people, and they would bring them down into Constantinople and into the Muslim region and sell them as Slavs or slaves. Right? And so that's where we get the term from. But slaves have a long history in the Mediterranean, in the Indian Ocean, and even in Asia, obviously in Africa, right, with the Indian Ocean. So it has a long history. It has a long history of being linked to at least ethnicity, if not race, as well, right? And then finally Africa. The East African region was enslaved much longer than the West African region. They think, your book tells you, and most books say, about 10 million in the West African trade from 1500 to 1800 at the transatlantic trade were taken from Africa. That's a 10 million statistic. East Africa is enslaved and subjected to slave traders much longer. And they calculate that in the ages over which slaves were traded in East Africa, that about 14 million people were subjected to slavery in that period. A very distinctive feature about the transatlantic trade is that all of them, almost without exception, were chattel slaves, which meant that they were chained to somebody for life. I mean, they were forever a piece of property. And that is not necessarily true in the other slave trades. And even in slavery in West Africa in the period, sometimes you were just enslaved for a short period of time, right? And they had all sorts of different relationships in West Africa itself about who was a slave and who was not. But when it came to the transatlantic system and the buying and selling of slaves into the Americas, almost all of them were chattel. Almost all of them were chained for life. Their children would be chattel slaves as well. So chattel slavery is a distinctive, the exclusiveness of chattel slavery, the distinctive feature of the South American Caribbean slave trade, which is where slaves from Africa went initially, and then they developed in especially the Caribbean region. Barbados was the island that was first most developed by plantation culture. And a plantation is a farm that is intended to make a cash crop. It's usually extensive lands, and they're going to plant usually with crops that required gang labor organization. And they operated, the labor that operated it was slaves, right? So there was a master and a slave on a plantation, and the agricultural crops were intended to be cash crops, and they planted them as vastly as they could. And so Barbados, was just the first island, but the rest of the Caribbean, and then also into the South American region. These plantations then developed slave laws and became a model for what would develop in North America when the southern states were settled, and they were settled by people who bought vast tracts of land, and they found that they could make lots of money as long as they planted extensively and used gang labor for production. And then they needed slaves because the southern state region was very unhealthy for the British who were settling the region at the time. All right, so that's just a quick background on slavery. I think the big things to remember: 10 million come over the transatlantic system. They are chattel slaves, and the plantation system, the model for it, really starts in the Caribbean, big, and in South America as well. All right, so that's the end of the presentation, and we'll move on to Europe in our next video presentation.